Namaskar, Adab, hello, and welcome to this segment of MythoLogical presented by Breakfast at Cinema, in which we will take a look at some of Hindi cinema's many attempts to bring to the big screen stories we have grown up listening to and those we go back to time and again throughout our lives. Mythology has always influenced cinema deeply. What, with the various plot templates it provides, the fact that these stories are already popular with the masses, and the scope for presenting grandeur and divinity while exploring new filmmaking techniques. For this event, we are focusing on mythology in Hindi cinema with four landmark films, mythology's influence on them, and their legacies. Let's talk about Cinema Creates Mythology. There once was a tyrant king who ruled his kingdom with an iron fist, helped by his demon helpers. The king was a cruel one in all respects, but his only redeeming quality was that he loved his sister dearly. When she chose for herself a suitable husband in the ruler of the neighboring kingdom, he happily got her married to him. On the day of the wedding, though, a prophecy foretold the death of the tyrant at the hands of his sister's child. The king, enraged and fearful, wanted to kill the newlyweds, but because of his love for his sister, he could not. Instead, he imprisoned them and killed their babies as soon as they were born. Unknown to him, one night, the father escaped, carrying his newborn child in a basket. The rains and storms lashed the kingdom that night. The river flooded and all hell broke loose. Carrying the basket on his head, the father waded through the swollen river, ready to swallow him and his child to cross to the other bank. There, he exchanged his child with that of his friends. He came back so that the king would not be suspicious. Hidden from the tyrant, his nephew grew up with an adoptive mother, but somehow kept longing to visit the capital of the kingdom, even though he had no clue about his past. The adoptive mother, knowing the history of the child, never let him venture in that direction, till one day there was an invitation from the tyrant himself. Generations of children grew up listening to these stories from their grandparents and parents, and later in the 1980s and 90s watched the staple Ramayana and Mahabharata unfold on television. A generation or so later, the family structure began to shift from large joint families with lots of time for sharing stories to nuclear families where, because of lack of time, television and popular cinema became the source of these stories. While our generation enjoyed watching Arun Govil and Nitish Bharadwaj play Ram and Krishna, and sometimes even imitating them while playing with friends, we were also quite aware that the production value of these serials were not at the best. The extravagance and grandeur we imagined while listening to these stories orally was not reflected in the lackluster production scales. Even the snake around Shiva's neck was an inanimate prop, which we made fun of as children. There seemed to have been no technical advancement in the screen depictions of divine miracles since the release of the low-budget Jai Santoshi Ma a little over a decade earlier. Slowly, though, India began to wake up to the effects of globalization, also heralding with it the way films began to be designed. Latest Hollywood blockbusters like Jurassic Park exposed viewers to magnificent visual effects with its dinosaurs. We were spellbound by the sight of a creature that didn't exist anymore, but was created using graphics technology and massive investment. Yet, television continued to churn out mythologicals. But very slowly, over the next 2 decades, because of an understanding of the kind of finances and technical know-how required to make quality shows on mythology, production value began to improve with an aspiration to meet international standards and make convincing VFX-based content. Urban India by now had attained better purchasing power and settled into a steady pace of life. There were interesting movies being made in India, but nothing that challenged our imagination or evoked nostalgia. By 2015, that changed. Everything we had imagined while listening to these stories, everything we had hoped our mythological stories looked like, came alive on screen with this same story of a prince exiled from his kingdom as a baby who comes back to take what is rightfully his. The childhood travels of Krishna had always been fascinating to Indian audiences. Therefore, with a new spin on the same tale, Bahubali shattered all records. Despite having actors who weren't prominent Hindi cinema figures, which is a must for Bollywood lovers, made in Telugu and Tamil and only dubbed in Hindi. And yet, the movie upon release became a force to reckon with among Hindi speaking audiences. It was indeed a very credible attempt to draw inspiration from our existing pantheon of mythological stories, especially the Mahabharata, combine them and create something altogether new. It had all the necessary dramatic elements this generation had grown upon, especially as far as mainstream cinema was concerned. Lost and found, revenge, drama, fight sequences, finding love, perseverance of the hero for a cause that begins not as his but that of the people, and an overall well constructed story. The similarities between Krishna Janmakatha and Bahubali are quite a few. A prince birthed in the dungeons to an imprisoned mother, carried across the river, brought up by another doting mother who is tired of her adoptive son's mischief, well aware that danger lies in the direction of the kingdom, and so on. The lifting of the shivling so that worshipping God is not a painful process is a theme central to Govardhan Katha. The similarities don't end here. There is Bahubali who, in hiding, defends the kingdom against an invader and marries the princess, just like Arjun in hiding defending the kingdom of Virat against Duryodhan's army, ultimately winning Princess Uttara's hand for his son Abhimanyu. In Mahabharata, the seed of conflict emerges from Dhritarashtra being deemed unfit to rule because he is blind. While in Bahubali, Bijjala Dev harbors the feeling that he was not made the king because he is crippled. In reality, it is because he is heartless and deranged. There is also an interesting comparison with the imprisonment of the central character Devsena with Sita and Ravan. The film also creates a different type of template for some rather typical roles. Bhishma from Mahabharata was duty bound and therefore could not raise his voice against Adharma. But in Bahubali, the duty bound Katappa questions the absolute nature of that promise and eventually ends up supporting Shiva. The women are cast in strong, meaningful roles and are characters who are trying to control their destinies and not accept whatever fate has dealt to them. They do not just sit in jail and lament their fate, they pick up the bow and arrow and fight in wars, defending not just their own rights but that of the unfortunate ones. While there are many similarities that Bahubali has with many mythological stories, the film weaves an excellent tale to create a mythology of its own. The first part ended on a cliffhanger that left the audiences hungry for more. Until the time the second part was released, the country remained obsessed with just one question: Katappa ne Bahubali ko kyun mara? Some said it was because the child Bahubali ate Katappa's food. It was quite possibly a marketing strategy and a really smart one in that. This gap between the release of the two parts fueled the mythology around this movie even more. Mythologies are so ancient, and especially because they were originally passed on from region to region, person to person, across times and changing socio-cultural contexts, they have constantly been tweaked, merged and re-merged into different forms down the ages and across lands and seas. The storytelling in Bahubali takes an idea like wrongdoing and mistreatment among brothers, which is the prevalent theme of Mahabharata, and the story of Krishna, to weave a tale that excites and meets the opulent scale that the audience always imagined a Mahabharata Ramayana should be. The film admittedly draws inspiration from the world of Amar Chitrakatha, Mahabharata, historical stories of the Chalukya kingdom, and many earlier films which fired the imagination of Indians in the areas of mythologicals, historicals, and folklore-based films. The scale of production makes Bahubali one of the most expensive Indian films made till date, and reminds one of the scale of production of films such as Mughal-e-Azam. The story spans decades and flows at epic levels, creating more aura around the film. There are 5 seasons of an animated series telling the story of the first Bahubali on an OTT platform. The language of Kalake's Kiliki was created especially for the film, just like Dothraki in Game of Thrones and Klingon in Star Trek. A graphic novel is already on the digital media. All of this points to the wonderful possibilities that the film is loaded with. Our country is replete with incidences where screen truth slowly turns into history. Many of us would not even for a second doubt the existence of an anarkali for whom Salim fought a war against his father Akbar. But historians still debate the authenticity of Mughal-e-Azam. With the right kind of atmosphere and push, Bahubali Shiva may come to acquire a similar status as that of Anarkali. The myth of Bahubali and its characters are key to a bright future for similar experiments in the realm of fantasy fiction in a country that loves its folk tales, mythologies, and histories.